So International, it done got me again. The cylinder head has a crack in it. Is leaking in the back corner at the number 6 exhaust port. It cracks right through the bolts and right through the bolt holes, and we're leaking. So it seems like, I mean, well, it doesn't seem like it is. I got to pull this head off. We got a replacement head, and I'm gonna swap it out. So take you along for the ride. I'll probably put it on time lapse for a bit of it, and move along. So I mean, basically we're just taking all the stuff off, taking the intake off. Don't think we gotta take the belt off. I'm gonna see what I can get. I'm gonna use this chain fall here. I'm in the different building because I have this chain fall. I can't get this truck close enough underneath the one that I have in the other building where I usually am, because I'll be right up against the toolbox and not be able to open the doors. So I'm over here. So like I said, we gotta pull the intake off. I drained the coolant and just start taking the stuff off. I got the doghouse open, so basically the issue is the crack is directly under this bolt hole on the bottom, and it leaks down the back of the block. You can see where it's all kind of rusted right there. It just comes out and pours right down there once you build up any pressure. So like I say, just start kind of taking stuff apart. Alright, so here I'm trying to take the cowl off. I gotta get the wipers off too. The engine sticks underneath the cab so much that to lift the head off, the middle is right about up against the windshield. So I'm gonna start pulling off the intake piping, basically because it's the first thing you get to up on top. So we'll take the air filter housing off, and then we'll take the intake pipe off. There's a hose that's on there that I'm pulling off now that goes to the air compressor, so it filters the air to it. I'm going to take off the wiper linkage. So right here I'm pulling off the charge air piping. The threads on that T-bolt there were a little bit rusty, so I kind of had to keep working it back and forth to get it off. But we got it. Sometimes it's hard to save hardware and stuff because the corrosion, you tend to break. So right here I'm taking the belt off. I got to get some of the accessories off, and I do have to remove everything off the front. So there's a air conditioner compressor bracket that's on top that is also a water outlet above the alternator, that I have to remove the alternator because there's a bolt that's behind the bracket that I can't get off. So right here I'm just kind of working the nut back and forth for the ground cable that's on the alternator. So I'm just trying not to break the stud off that's in there. And we gotta pull the 4 bolts off that actually mount the alternator to the bracket. So now we can tuck the harness up out of the way a little bit. So right here, that is a little elbow that comes off of that turbo that has another hose that goes into, I want to say, like a vapor canister. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it goes into that. So right here I'm trying to disconnect the heater hoses. There's 2 pipes. One pipe goes to the water pump, or right behind the water pump, and the other one goes up to the air conditioning compressor bracket. It's that black pipe that kind of goes up to the bracket above the alternator bracket. That's the one that I can't get out because there's a bolt that's in the middle right underneath that sensor. So right here I'm trying to get it out, and then I realize there's a bolt holding it on. So it's like, well, I'll put the bolts back in and then I'll just take the piping out. So I took the bolt out there, I tried to get the pipe out, and it's just seized right in there. So I figured it's best to just leave it, and I'm down to the only alternative is to take that alternator bracket off. I think there's 4 bolts. They go through the timing cover and then through that bracket. So we got to get those off. The nuts are a little bit hard to get to because they're kind of hidden and tucked in behind there. But we end up getting them off and pulling that out of there. So I had to get that tensioner off too because that was kind of in the way. So right now we got all those bolts loose. I'm just pulling the harness out, and I think the harness kind of wrapped around one of them bolts and it needed to be taken off. So there goes the water outlet. And right here I'm just pulling the harness off the front that goes to the crank or cam sensor. So I'm just disconnecting the harness along the way so I can kind of get it out of the way and move it to the side. There's that bracket up on top that I'm taking off. That's where the part of the alternator harness goes across the top there. So I figured time to remove those and pull that piece of wiring out of the way. And then there was another bracket up there that held the top coolant pipe that I pulled off as well. Right here I'm taking there's a U-bolt that holds that crossover tube there that goes from this EGR cooler to the other one, and I loosened up those, and then I'm going to take the bolts out that hold that tube on. So pull those out there. They're kind of weird bolts. They're not really threaded very well. They're a little bit odd, but you obviously want to make sure you don't strip the threads, being that it's stainless, they can gall up. So right now I'm just pulling out the mounting bolts that go through the exhaust manifold to hold that EGR cooler on. So now we got that off. I'm trying to work at the turbo feed line that I just moved up out of the way. I ended up not being able to get that off because it was seized on the fitting that comes out of the oil filter housing. So right here I'm also taking the exhaust manifold off now and trying to get the mounting bolts off that hold them down. Obviously you get 2 of them per cylinder, and then right there that's a back pressure or exhaust back pressure tube. Some of the stuff I try not to touch too much if I think it's going to be a problem, and most exhaust stuff is generally going to be a problem. So I left that in there, and I just kind of worked around it. So right here I'm taking off the water outlet on the thermostat housing, and the thermostat is right underneath that tube there, and this is the upper radiator piping. Pull that out of the way. So I had to take that heat shield off so I can get to the rest of the exhaust manifold bolts. I found they weren't really all that hard to get to. Some of them, I mean that one right there with the wrench, it's a little tricky getting in there, but it wasn't anything that was too difficult. I ended up taking the fender off and the fender liners off so it's easier to get at the sides of the engine, because generally there would be a fender right where I'm sitting, and it would be obviously in the way. So just finishing up, taking out the exhaust manifold bolts. And pull that out of there. I pulled it out in one assembly. I didn't put it back in one assembly. It's just easier to take it out that way. Well, I got this side all done. So there's actually a lot of piping and everything. It's really kind of a pain to get this all apart, to be honest. But Anyway, so this is all done. This hose is still connected on the other side along with the wire. I'll just kind of unhook that from the other EGR cooler and move it to the side. So I don't know how good a view you had, but there's only so much I can do. So I get this side, looks just as good as the other side. So what do I gotta do? I gotta do the EGR cooler, the intake obviously, throttle valve, fuel filter, oil injection line, and then the relays in the back for the grid heater. Then after that, I might take the fan off. I think I'm gonna try to take the fan off once I get some of this off. I could just kind of unbolt the fan to get that out of there, so I got some moving room. Might not have to, but I mean there might be enough room in there. We'll see. Once we get that off, obviously rocker arms, oil manifold. I'll probably reseal the oil manifold as well while I'm at it, get new pucks for it. This did have a starting problem. It's kind of weird though, because every time I checked with the scan tool, the oil pressure came up like it was supposed to. So it's kind of a weird one, to be honest. So yeah, keep pulling this apart. So right here I'm removing the hose clamps for the coolant lines that go from one EGR cooler to the other. They kind of run them in series there. And pulling the wiring harnesses off as I go. So there's a little bracket. It's like it's got 4 bolts in it that bolt the EGR valve to the timing cover as like a support. So right here I was going to take that hose clamp off, but I decided I'd just kind of leave it on there, and I'll get it as one big piece. So I'm taking the 3 bolts off there that go into the intake, and yeah. So there's the same type of bracket that holds the EGR cooler on. I think this one has 3 bolts in it, and I was trying to get those out. They go through the intake there, and there's the high pressure oil line that goes into the head goes right by those bolts, or actually pretty much right in front of it, and you really can't get them out with that hose there, because that hose is actually, it's pretty short and it's actually very stiff and it doesn't want to move. So I managed to eventually get it off, but I think I have to take the hose off first, which is what I'm doing now. So I'm removing the hose so I can get that bolt out, because since it goes through the intake, you can't get it out far enough, and it's kind of locked in there. So there's actually a very specific process to putting these EGR coolers back in. I don't know how sensitive they are, but I know it was actually pretty time consuming. You got to tighten them up, tighten the clamps up, loosen the clamps, tighten them, loosen them, and then set them to, I don't know, 15 inch-pounds or 150 inch-pounds or something. I can't remember exactly. Right here I got to pull that airbox bracket off because it's kind of in the way. So I was kind of plugging away at it. There's a bracket there that goes, obviously holds the oil fill and dipstick tube to the fuel filter housing. They got some fuel lines. I think you got a line goes in and a line goes out. So there's two separate lines kind of looping around, and that's what I was just removing there. And then you also have plastic lines. You see I'm pulling one off there. I think that is the supply line, and then there's a return line that's on there as well. Those just have plastic clips with O-rings that go into the side of the housing. So this has a rubber protective sleeve around the majority of the wiring harness, and it's bolted to the bottom of the intake there. So I had to kind of get some of them off to separate it from the head, because I didn't want to take the whole harness off, but I obviously had to remove it from the intake bolts. It's right there. There's only like what, four bolts that hold that fuel filter housing on, and then there's kind of a like that seal in the back there. It's like an oval, and it presses up against the head, or presses up against the intake, and then that's how fuel is fed through the intake, through a hole there that goes into the side of the head. It's a little different on these than it was on the non-EGR engines. So right here I'm pulling off the intake elbow there that has the throttle valve on it. There's four bolts that hold that on, and two of the bottom ones are actually kind of seized in there pretty good. I had to kind of work it back and forth to get them out. I think it's because the holes go all the way through the intake, and it allowed them corrode from the backside. So right there, that harness I was just taking off was for the fuel injectors and the sensors that are in the oil manifold. So I'm using an impact hammer there with a chisel bit to try to hammer on the edge of the fan clutch there. It kind of breaks it loose, and then I can just spin it off like that. It works all right, but it leaves a little bit of a mark in the clutch there. So I'm pulling the bolts off of the pulley. It's kind of stuck on there too. I kind of have to kind of pry it and keep working it around. And then I got all butterfingers, and I ended up dropping it anyway. So I'm pulling the 4 bolts out there that hold that bracket on to the front of the head. So this right here was the relays. They're on a bracket that go to the grid heater. Now I'm taking the valve cover off. I think there's like 12 bolts that hold that down. I'll pull that off, and that's the inside of the engine there a little bit. So I'm pulling the harness off the top and disconnecting all the injectors there. There's a ICP sensor, I believe, and then there's also a oil manifold pressure sensor that works with the engine brake. They're both the same sensor, just so you know. And then in the middle there is a solenoid and a valve for the exhaust brake. So that manifold's actually full of oil, and it's surprisingly heavy. So right now I'm just prying it up off the top of the injector so I can let it drain a little bit, because it's going to run oil out all over the place. You got to kind of flip it upside down so it doesn't run all over you. And then once I pulled it off, it actually let all the oil come flowing out of the bottom of the fitting that goes into the side of the head as well. So I just put a cap on there to keep it from running all over the side of the engine too. I'm just kind of letting it drain there. So right now we're going to pull off the rocker arms. It all comes off in kind of one piece. I think one of the stands got stuck on the engine. There's little plastic washers that kind of hold it all on, and I think one of them was missing. So I like to take everything and put it all in order. So I put all of the push rods in order, and I put all of the bridges in order. I don't think the bridges matter so much, but the push rods will, because they kind of wear themselves into the seats on the rocker arm and then the lifter. So I'm pulling out all the injectors here. It's a Torx bolt that goes through the bracket that holds it down, and as you loosen it, it actually pulls it out. So you don't have to physically pull them out. You just loosen them up, and it ejects them at the same time. So pulling all the head bolts out. I think there's like 26 of them or something. Quite a few of them. I don't remember exactly how many are there. So hooking up the chain so we can lift it out. I ended up not using the lifting ring that's there because it was kind of in the way, but I did use the hole that it was in. So put some pressure on it and kind of just popped it loose. Right there, pick it up, turn it sideways, and shove it out of the way. So right here you can see where the crack runs down the back of the head through the bolt hole. It's actually a pretty expensive repair. That's not the first time I've seen this. From what I hear from people, it's pretty common. But anyway, I'd like to thank you for watching, and hope you come back for part 2.